All right, so next up, we're going to talk about the information sharing framework. And to lead that discussion is Rob Dew. Since 2018, he served as a Senior Technologist Advisor for Emergency Communications within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. You've probably seen them all over LinkedIn lately and in the news talking about all kinds of attacks that are going on. So Rob provides overall technical advisement on design, development, testing, and deployment of priority and interoperability for next-gen network priority services, wireless priority services, long-term evolution transition to 5G, secure data exchange, and Internet of Things capabilities for emergency communications stakeholders. Thanks for coming, Rob. Take it away.
All right, so I just want to do a quick check. So Sheriff Fitz, Ravi, and Phil, can you guys hear me?
Sheriff Fitzgerald,
All right, great, good. I don't have to go hide in the bathroom then. Okay, good. We need to start it. So my job's going to be really easy as moderator because we've got fantastic panelists here. So online, we've got Sheriff Fitz. He served as the Sheriff of Story County, Iowa for 32 years. He's had a very impressive career in law enforcement. He's been a patrol officer, detective, field training officer, tactical team member, firearms instructor, patrol supervisor, and even talk about the diving stuff that you do. It's and he's also taught a police science program at Hawkeye Community College. At the national level, Sheriff Fitz is a member of just about everything. He's been a member of FirstNet. He's been in the National Sheriff's Association, the Public Safety Spectrum Trust, FBI National Academy Association. So when we do these talks on ISF, he gets us into all these organizations. He's got the secret handshake. So also online, we've got Ravi Talluri. He leads Amazon Web Services, state and local government transportation vertical solutions. Over the last 2 years, he's been focusing on AWS compute and storage services with 5G private networks, data exchanges for inter and intra-agency coordination, and providing mobile edge computing infrastructure for developing, deploying, and scaling ultra-low latency applications. We've also got Phil Beckett online. He's a CEO of C3HIE, a nonprofit health information exchange based in Texas with the mission to improve health outcomes and reduce costs through collaboration and data sharing, especially for rural health. And in the room with me in the center, we've got Carla Jurens. She's the Texas Statewide Interoperability Coordinator, or SWIC. She's been involved in the operation and technical aspects of communications as she assists agencies across the state with technical issues and supports efforts for communications planning. All right. And we've also got, Jeff Telford. He's the Chief Product Officer with Javari. They're on the far left. And now that we've got the lady and all the gentlemen out of the way, now we can introduce John. So John's been in the transportation and public safety space for over 40 years. I've worked very closely with John for over 5 years on this. So he's kind of like my partner in this. He really came up with a lot of the concepts that we're going to talk about for the ISF. John's presently works for Skyline Technology Solutions, focused on network operations, cybersecurity, and video interoperability. And he's going to go into a lot of the stuff on the ISF and a lot of the video sharing operational proof of concepts that we've done. So before we begin the presentation, I'd just like our chair of SAFECOM, NICSWIC Task Force, Sheriff Fitz, to say a few words, if you would. Sheriff Fitz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. For over 4.5 years, Carla, John, Rob, and I have worked together in the SAFECOM, NICSWIC, ISF task force. In that time, we'd taken the ISF from an architectural concept to a SAFECOM approved final document, executed multiple operational proofs of concept to vet the ISF, and we are now at the stage of engaging with industry for the ISF technical proof of concept, the ISF as a service platform. This morning, we will be discussing the basic applications, the challenges of the information sharing framework. The panelists gathered from state and federal government and private industry will also discuss practical applications across sectors using case studies to show the ISF in action. But more importantly, we'll discuss how they have used the ISF for solutions and strategies. It is my hope that you will leave with a clear understanding of the ISF impact. Our goal, along with the ISF, is to make data interoperability and secure and enable information sharing across communication systems and technical and traditional organizational boundaries. First responders, national security, and emergency preparedness personnel should be able to discover, access, and consume any relevant information on a need-to-know basis, regardless of jurisdiction, affiliation, or location. I look forward to an engaging discussion. And with that, back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Sheriff Fitz. So starting on the first slide, so every few years, SafeCom conducts a nationwide survey amongst our public safety stakeholders and responder practitioners. What you see on the left is a sample of some of the services, applications, data, and technologies our stakeholders need to securely share for increased situational awareness during an emergency event. But they may be bringing different applications with disparate data sets with them. So John, when he usually does this, he usually starts off and says, you know, everyone in the room, who wants interoperability? And everybody raises their hand, right? And then the next question is, who wants to share their data? So some hands tend to go down after that. So although there are a lot of technical challenges, the real difficulty in implementation is having the right people and agreements and processes in place to allow that data sharing. And that ties in, if you were here yesterday, Dan Cotter showed the SafeCom interoperability continuum. And he mentioned yesterday that there are a lot of swim lanes with that, and technology is only one of them. So it's not just about technology. So really the point of this slide is to really say that we need to do the diagram on the right if we want to share the information on the left. Next slide, please. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but this is just to show that incident communications in dense urban areas can require a lot of coordination between different entities, emergency comms technologies, and services to move a lot of information without introducing a lot of complexity. However, in rural areas, it can be very challenging as you may lose some of that connectivity and the tools that you have due to lack of coverage or capacity. And this can also happen in urban areas if there's network congestion or there's a cyber, kinetic, or jamming attack on the network. So Charlie Gademi, John, and hopefully Red Grasso can join remotely, are going to talk about PACE planning, which was also mentioned yesterday, and that's going to address some of the challenging scenarios you have when you get into dense rural areas and you start losing dense urban areas and you start losing capabilities due to network degradation, or you're in rural areas where you might not have the connectivity, coverage, and capacity. But the point of the ISF is it really seeks to address both of these morphologies across the spectrum, so wherever an incident can happen from dense urban to rural. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that we show. We say, you know, where does the information sharing framework really come in? And when it really comes in is when you get up to a regional or state level. Usually at a local level, the first responders know each other. They may be on the same CAD system with the same software release, even maybe using the same customization. But when you get up to a regional level or state level or national or international level, the ISF is going to have to scale with that. And that's when information sharing can become quite difficult. And there's an example of the Broadband program that's over in Europe where they're tying a lot of their public safety LTE networks together. So they'll be looking at data interoperability for mission critical services across different borders of European countries. So the ISF becomes more relevant at regional and beyond that, and it must scale. Okay, next slide, please. So we kind of mentioned Sheriff Fitz was the head of our SafeCom information sharing task force. Carla, who I forgot to mention, is also vice chair of the National Council of Statewide Interoperability Coordinators, or NGN-PS. John, Walt Magnuson, we've had various people around the room as members of the task force over the years. But what we wanted to do when we made this task force is we wanted it to be the relevant people. We wanted to have people from urban, suburban, and rural jurisdictions. We wanted to have law enforcement, fire service, EMS, and transportation. And we wanted to have technology, policy, and operations. And the goal was to develop a document that could be used for acquisition of products, whether they're network services, hardware, or software, and data exchange to ensure interoperability, security, scalability, and also a checklist for regulatory, legal, and privacy issues. The document also walks through various use cases, so like a traffic stop or an active shooter, earthquake, and it shows the various types of content that needs to be shared. Like in the previous session on TAC, obviously GIS and video is content for situational awareness, but also sensor data. and how this data would be shared during an incident. So there's going to be a contest at the end, and if you win, you get a free copy of this document, and if you lose, then you get 2 copies of the document. So, but anyways, there's a link that's a little bit covered up there. It's a long link, so you get the executive summary part's only about 10 pages. It's about a 50-page document, so it's not too difficult to read. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so as John started thinking about the ISF concept and when he was a SWIC in Maryland, we're going to go to the source. So John, would you like to please run through the 3-layer cake?
Thank you. Sure, Rob. When I was considering these concepts is when I was the acting Deputy Homeland Security Advisor in Maryland before there were SWICs. And it's a generalized concept that's trying to get people to think about how you need to deal with the interoperability solution. You're always going to have the case where at the data layer at the bottom, you have disparate data sets that live in siloed information systems across multiple jurisdictions. And while standards have their place in terms of creating interoperability, you're always going to have outliers who don't have the same solution, who don't conform to the standard, who has some proprietary elements in it. And so the challenge is, how do you get data from the data layer to the presentation layer, which is the end user who wants to see that information, that content in the application of their choice? And so if you're in emergency management, it might be WebEOC that you want to see the information in. It might be TAC that you want to see the information in. But the reality is the data content lays at the data layer, and the application at the presentation layer is what the end user wants to see it in. So fundamentally, the concept is you have to invest in the integration layer in the middle to do the necessary translation between those two layers. This is not rocket science. I will admit that in 2003 and 2004, when we were conceptualizing this, it was rocket science because you didn't have the internet like we have today. You didn't have cloud computing. And a lot of those tools have developed over the years in some sense to respond to this need by people to see data from across a number of different data sets. Next slide, please. So the question then becomes, what do you have to do in the integration layer? So our partners over at Johns Hopkins APL in the back row, raise your hand. They helped us frame this up and go do a deeper dive in the integration layer. And we basically said, what are the functions that the integration layer has to perform? Well, there are 5 functions the integration layer has to perform. 1, data discovery. How do you find the information that you need? Okay. So then you find the information. The second thing is credentialing and access management. Do I have rights to that system? Can I actually see the data in that system? So you have to authenticate the individual trying to access the system. The third thing is then you actually have to do the data exchange. That's really where standards come in. What methodology are we going to use? And it varies, because if you're talking about video, it's all about MPEG-4, it's all about H.264 format. But if you're talking about GIS, it's all about ArcGIS and Esri standards and the like, or OGC standards, okay? So the content is going to drive the tools you use to actually do the data exchange. So you found the data that you need, you have access to that data, you now know how you have to move the data from the layers across the layers. Then you actually have to do the analytics. I use an example where I don't want to see the current streaming video. I want to see the video that happened a half hour ago when the accident occurred. So there's some level of analytics to parse the data that needs to be performed. And lastly, you have to do transport. You have to move the data from where it lives in a proprietary system in the data layer, do the massaging of the information in the integration layer, and then publish it to the end user in the presentation layer. So those 5 functions are essential. So this is the framework of how you have to think about interoperability. And you've seen examples of this today. Budge Courier, when he showed that really big graphic, all the stuff in the middle was the integration layer. And he had to use different tools and different techniques to accomplish these functions, but they all revolve around those functions. So that was the idea of the ISF, was to actually look at that. Next slide.
So one of the things on the, could you just go back one slide, sorry. So on the identity management, so the next panel, Matt Moyer and others are going to talk about ICAM. So that's a way of doing this identity management. And Jared talked about with TAC, the federated ICAM. So that's going to be a very important part of it. I also wanted to point out, we broke the integration layer into two pieces. So a lot of the industry comes back and says, well, okay, if this is all interoperable and everything, like how do we make any money off of this? So in the common area, transport, we kind of know where that is with the broadband providers or satellite or LMR. But the discovery, identity management, and data exchange, we do want that to be somewhat standardized and interoperable, but you can still do the analytics in the custom layer. So that secret sauce where you're taking data, it was brought up in NG-911. We're going to have all these videos coming in NG-911. There's probably going to have to be something at the edge of the wireless networks to run analytic on those videos to do data triage, look for DDoS attacks and other security things before it gets internal, where, like Budge discussed, they do have a lot of security involved there. So just wanted to mention that. Next slide.
Yeah, on this slide, thank you, Rob. This also says that this model can be used whether you're a data owner or you're a data consumer. And there are different questions that you need to ask. If you're a data owner, like Rob said at the beginning, everyone said,
interoperability, all the hands go up. Then you go level, who's willing to share their data? These are the kind of questions you have to ask yourself if you're a data owner. Are you ready to share? With whom do you want to share? How are you going to share? Those are the tough questions that actually get to the heart of actually sharing data across agencies and jurisdictions and platforms. And the same for the consumer. What data do I need? Do I need everything? No offense against law enforcement, but the knee-jerk reaction is I want it all. And we're like, well, but I'm not sharing, right? So you have to really answer these tough questions in order to understand, what you're going to do. Next slide. This is an example in the video.
We go there, just let the hand off of it. So Jared and Captain Reinhardt in the tax section did a really good job of talking about the GIS and video capability. So I wanted to just give Carla a chance to talk about, as a SWIC in Texas, some of the issues and challenges you ran into developing and deploying TAC in Texas.
All right, so there's a few SWICs and some former SWICs here, and I think one of the things we're always looking for is not only that interoperability works, but it needs to be easy. And I think that's probably, we're just maybe getting to the point where we're looking at this problem as a whole and making it a little easier for our local folks. So one of the things with TAC is, not that it was accidental or on purpose, but through all of the collaboration with federal, state, and local agencies, it's kind of become a natural integration layer. And I think that's really important to, bring into our thoughts of everybody down the data layer. They can use whatever they want to use. Texas is a whole little state. I can't tell anybody what to do. I can suggest, I can beg, I can cajole, I can maybe control some grant funding. But when it comes right down to it, whatever method of gathering their data they want to use, they are going to use it. And so having something that can naturally make that integration happen and then put it out on the screen, so to speak, is invaluable. I think that that's one of the more unique things about the natural evolution of TAC is that we have come to that because there are a lot of APIs out there. A lot of companies have integrated their solution into TAC so that the presentation layer includes everybody. Doesn't matter what equipment the guy or gal out in the field tromping around has on their belt. It all comes up into the presentation layer. So my DPS, colonel can see it. The Texas Military Department can see it. So it all puts it all together. And that's on the situational awareness data side. We're not quite there on all of the video solutions, but I think we have some things coming up that some of our vendors are working on. The other thing that we did put, instead of waiting for a standard, we did put it in our statewide communications interoperability plan, or our SCIP, that TAC is a preferred method of doing situational awareness, and we added a Bridge for Public Safety as our preferred method of chat/collaboration. I'm going to say chat is probably very far behind on having anything naturally occur as an integration layer. So I think that's probably something that really needs to be focused on. And I think that's an important part of our business. And that's really what
Great, thanks, Carla. Next slide, please. So this was an operational POC that we did at the Interoperability Institute here in 2022. And in fact, the MC of today, Michael Fox, was the one who created this diagram. And the point of this is to show that the ISF isn't just some theoretical exercise, and it can actually do real world scenario of video sharing, taking from cameras, from drones. So I'm going to hand it back to John, because John was really instrumental as well in creating a lot of the video sharing platforms that we use in the National Capital Region. So you want to step through this, John?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I want to reiterate what Rob said, that this model is, while it's a general framework, it's a useful model for having conversations between the technology people and the end users. So you start to talk about, well, what data layer systems do you want to talk to? Well, there were Genetec systems on campus. There were also some disaster city cameras. There were also some drone footage. So we identified the data layer solutions that we wanted to integrate. And then we said, okay, what do we want to publish into? What is the end user going to use? It could be TAC as a display in the application presentation layer. In last year's exercise, we leveraged Blue Force. And so Blue Force was both a web client as an app on the phone. We also could publish to an Esri map, for example. So how do you get the data from where it lives to the top layer, the presentation layer? Company I work for now, Skyline, it's not an advertisement, but they do sell a solution, a video interoperability solution that we leveraged in the integration layer. And so it ingested into the transcoding appliance all the different flavors of video, did the translation, and published H.264 video, which could then be ingested into Bluetooth and into Esri and so forth. And so we basically use this to actually identify the pieces and parts. Now, ultimately, you need a wiring diagram that lists actual IP addresses and, all that. But what I've found in my experience is, when you talk to the technologists, they try to go right to the wiring diagram. This is like a useful tool as an interim step to identify the pieces and parts. And then you actually start to map out the nuts and bolts that you need to accomplish the interoperability. So this is what we did last year during Interop, or 2 years ago, 22. There you go. Back to you, Rob.
Great, thanks, John. So staying on video is the content sharing and also use of drones. So Sheriff Fitz in Story County, they've been using drones a lot for video surveillance. And Sheriff Fitz, could you take a couple minutes to talk about some of the security and operational issues and challenges you faced in using UASs in Iowa?
Sure, thanks, Rob. We, as an example, we had a neighboring county who had a school shooting a couple months ago. And so we responded with our drones and gave them an aerial overview of what's going on. The technology in our drones and our fleet of drones that we have a live scan task, so somebody in the command center can see what's going on. However, when that's done, and that agency wants the file that we have showing what the drones were seeing during that event, the only way we really have to do it is to put that on a flash drive and then deliver it to that agency. Well, a lot of agencies through their ITs, they have various protocols, and they aren't very welcoming to just have any flash drives come in. So there's some problems there that we have right now on Exchange. Had we had the ISF, we would be able to be doing file sharing and file documents and taking that file we have of the drone coverage and just streaming it to or sending it to that agency. And at that point, they would have everything they needed. But right now, we're still back to manual, and it takes so much to be in a position where it could be done so easily. As this technology evolves and the task force keeps working and developing this, I believe that soon we will have these capabilities, and it will be a great enhancement for public safety.
Thanks, Sheriff Fitz. So we've been talking a lot about some of the issues around video as a content, video interoperability for situational awareness, but to pivot to another type of content, I want to bring in Phil.
Phil, can you give us some background on some of the issues you've seen in the health industry? Specifically, this would be, medical records and so forth that EMS personnel would have to be sharing during an event.
Sure, Rob. No, thank you. And hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep, we hear you fine.
Great. I want, so the healthcare industry thinks it's special, but it's much like all of this. And I think there's so many parallels here. But going back to what my day job is a health information exchange. What we do is sort of prepare some of that data layer, and that hospitals and physicians send us data, we clean it up and make it, standardized, so that if you're coming to Texas, ideally, it doesn't quite work like this, of course, but ideally you can hit one endpoint, us, and get all the healthcare data on an individual in one place. You don't have to go and connect to every clinic and, every one doc practice, every rural hospital, every city hospital. You can kind of get that in one place. So that's, and I'm going to come back to the sort of national efforts in healthcare as well, but I also want to share a story. During Hurricane Harvey, I live in Houston part-time, get plenty of hurricanes there. I'm working in the shelter in the George R. Brown Center. And a 9-year-old boy comes to me in that clinic situation, and he tells me he's allergic to some foodstuffs, but he doesn't know what it is, and he doesn't want to get given that in the shelter, so he wants to find out what that is. So again, because I'm there and I can access medical records, I pull that up. And get him his allergy information. But it also turns out that this kid is on his own somewhere in Hurricane Harvey. Is got split up from his whole family. They don't know where they are. His mother's cell phone number is part of that record, and I can call his mom. I find she's miles away, but through that reconnect this this family, obviously concerned about each other and where they are. So so the power of this and what you're all talking about, how you do it, is so critical at that individual level. Coming back to where healthcare is trying to deal with this is that 21st Century Cures Act and TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, trying to set at the national level, one, a trusted exchange framework, i.e. that's a technical standard for sharing data, and then the common agreement is how do we do that? How do we have one agreement that says you have access to that data? Again, would love to see ways how we integrate with ISF, with the ISF approach, and put those together and leverage each other. The other component in healthcare that we've got is PULSE, which stands for Patient Unified Lookup System in an emergency, which enables, so, going back to the hurricane situation, you don't only have local first responders, they come from all over the country. Now they've got to be, you've talked about this, but you've got to be quickly credentials, authorized to see those medical records. So some of that's been used in California in the wildfires. We've got it available in Texas too. And that becomes a quick way, again, to credential people and access them to the information that they need. I think the other piece that I want to leave this part with is the individual themselves, getting them, having them access to their own medical records available through their phone. Imagine a first responder could, they could scan a QR code that would give them access to that individual's record, and the individual is then obviously have to be conscious and have their phone, but as another pathway for getting information. So we kind of think about these multi-layers of how do we get this information? It's not a single track with the appropriate authorization. And how do we do that together across law enforcement? I think, and then I'll end with also, we are working in Texas with Department of Public Safety so that the law enforcement officers can share data with the healthcare industry.
Fantastic, Phil. Thanks. Next slide, please. So I won't go into a whole lot of this, but this is kind of like what I see as like the nirvana of the emergency communications ecosystem. This was mentioned in the first panel with NG911. Brian, talked about end-to-end communications. Fabricio certainly talked about it as well as Budge and Brandon. And so I took all that complexity they were talking about and put it in just a little cloud on the lower left there. But all that stuff in the first panel exists there.
And kind of the nirvana is if we have an incident site where the networks start getting congested, ultimately, no matter what wireless network or wireline network, the first responder, critical infrastructure stakeholder, national security emergency preparedness users on, we want them to be able to communicate. We know like in Katrina, there were other access technologies like Wi-Fi that came up first. So in the upper left, you see Wi-Fi there, and we've put Wi-Fi priority through Wi-Fi 7. We're doing test cases with that with the Wi-Fi Alliance. So the ultimate goal is we want our users to be able to communicate across lots of different devices, lots of different access technologies, and have that end-to-end so that when the public sends a video of a fire, chemical spill, or whatever, it goes to the wireless network, it goes across the ESINet, it goes into the PSAP or control room for my friends in Europe, and then they can identify the priority level of the first responder and what network they may be on when they send that back out again. And you really can't do that without having SIP, like Fabricio talked about, end-to-end, and that's kind of the nirvana goal we're going for. But we're looking at a trusted interconnect, right? Because if we've got information passing between wireless or wireline carriers, we want to be able to track that at layer 2, layer 3. We want to be able to do operations in KPPs. We want to make sure the priority is right, and we want to do the security. So the trusted interconnect has to have a zero trust architecture where we're constantly vetting services, devices, users on the network to make sure they're secure. We're just assuming that it's been compromised because we don't know all the vendors and the supply chain vendors that may be there if they're all necessarily trusted vendors. Next slide, please. Yeah, so right now we have these priorities: wireless priority service and the government emergency telecommunications service. They're wireline services that work for voice and have interoperability with 20 wireless and wireline carriers. But now what we're doing and going into 5G, now we have cloud computing, we've got virtualization of cores, we've got AI coming in. The wireless providers are working with their cloud infrastructure partners. And so we're moving to a world where from hundreds of thousands of users, we could have tens of millions of users that are critical infrastructure, public safety, national security going on many different devices with IoT. And so we're moving just from interoperable voice and data and video priority services within one network to try to interoperate that to go to something we call data, video, and information services between carriers and between different access technologies. So we're looking at things like federated network slicing, that sort of thing. But I wanted to put some on the ISF. It is a framework for acquisition. It can be used in a lot of different scenarios, whether it's video. John and I have been working with the state of Iowa, Department of Public Safety, on tying their CAD systems together and their PSAPs and getting ready for NG911 and kind of organizing that with ISF principles. But in terms of like an actual service for the ISF, so can we deliver a service to users with tools? The ISF is really trying to do this information services part, and that hasn't really been done yet, where you've got different applications, disparate data. How do you share them during a major event with security, with priority, and make them interoperable? Next slide, please. So these are some of the challenges that we have. So in the 5G ecosystem, because we're starting with 4G and 5G, all these integration layer functions that we talked about, where is it going to reside? What's going to be centralized? What's going to be distributed? What are the cloud providers going to be doing? What are the wireless and wireline carriers going to be doing for these IMS-based services? And also the ability to track it with KPPs end to end. That's why that trusted interconnect is so important. We want to be able to have visibility at layer 2 and layer 3 to make sure that the video has the right latency, it's the right QoS, it's the right bandwidth. We know if we're originating at 1080p camera quality, but we've got to go into a congested terminating cell, but there's only 5 megabits per second, we've got to push it down to 720p quality. So having that end-to-end visibility is really important. Jared talked about something which has been a big frustration, and that's why Texas moved forward with TAC, is that we really don't have one set of emergency communications data standards. We've got things like NEAM, which are very, very helpful. We've got EIDD, we've got EIDO, but we know that if we just wait for standards, it's going to take too long, and we're never going to get everybody on one standard. And then how we deploy the ISF, it's not a magic button, but we want it as a holistic platform. It'll probably be a service that we're hoping to scale with the wireless providers at first, but we know we're going to have tools that we're going to have to give users. So once they're onboarded in this service, whether they're with different jurisdictions, different wireless carriers, they need to be able to interoperate and talk to one another. But they're going to need tools to set that up. What are the trust marks? What's the federated ICAM going to look like? The people and processes are going to have to be tools to set that up. And we know as we cross cloud infrastructure, where right now, if it's not going to be IMS, we can't just have it being best effort. So we're going to have network redundancy, but we're probably going to have some kind of application priority or HTTP2, something like that, to give it some kind of priority for that service when it's going over cloud infrastructure. And then the role of AI, which you can't see here, there's obviously a lot of privacy concerns. Next slide. So where we are right now, we've been through this whole people and process. We wrote the document we mentioned. We've been through a lot of operational proofs of concept for video, for CAD, NG911 preparation. We feel we've got a lot of functional performance requirements. So we're now at the stage of going with industry. So we've got an RFI out on the street. We're going to be moving to an RFP this year. But since now we're talking about industry, what I wanted to do is get Robbie involved from Amazon. And Robbie, if you could talk about how you solve this solution in some other verticals outside of public safety. What can we expect for sorry, Robbie, one second. I just need to say one more thing. So the technical POC, we're trying to answer 4 questions with industry. One is it technically feasible? We held something at Interoperability Institute in January 2023 with industry, and we believe it is feasible. The second thing is, can we operationalize it with KPPs? If we can't operationalize it and know how it's going to perform in congestion, if it's going to be secure, we can't really release it. We also need to get buy-in from industry so that they can actually adopt it and scale it. Because if industry is not going to adopt it and scale it, then it's going to be a science project. It's never going to get indirectly into the hands of stakeholders. And lastly, what you can't see on the screen is this is a big challenge. So we get all the technology stuff out of the way and the people in process, but if it's not intuitive and it's not of value to public safety, and it's not something that they can easily use, it's not going to overload them with information, it's going to allow them to pull down the information that's accurate, timely, and when they need it, this is all useless. And so that's going to be a big part of the technical POC. So sorry, Robbie, I'm going to hand it off to you now. If you can give us some background on how you've solved this state interoperability issue with other verticals and some of the KPPs and best practices.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on the panel. A key enabler for all of this is setting up that data platform that breaks down the organizational silos, and then you have actionable data. Some of this could be based on knowledge base. Others could be AI/ML, inferring, running analytics, and being able to communicate downstream, whether it's over the mobile networks, whether it's through CV2X. CV2X as a concept is starting to come into play, real-time situational awareness that would be relevant for the entire state. Texas is at the forefront. Utah is another state that has set up this data exchange. There are quite a few grants that are available from US DOT to build out these data exchanges, and having these data exchanges and data platforms interoperable across multiple government agencies, I think is going to be one of the key problems to solve. And within that context, some of the KPIs that we are typically working with from an agency perspective is how do we improve the response times from an incident perspective? Keys are to reduce the communication delays, increasing the information flow, and then leveraging all the assets that are available. And typically that's done by a coordination center, which allows all of these agencies to quickly move and safely clear any kind of roadway incidents. The next step is reducing congestion. What are the coordination strategies for congestion management, including things like opening detour routes, prioritizing and rerouting transit, coordinating with private sector, in this case, mapping providers for real-time commute trip reduction, and then being able to provide this information to the traveling public. And the key, again, this would be continuous improvement where you're continuously accessing this data to kind of identify the effectiveness of the response strategies, and then making sure that improvements are rolled in as part of future updates.
All right, fantastic, Robbie. Thank you. So, Jeff, with Jamari, obviously, web EOC, a big tool public safety used for a long time for situational awareness. How do you see this from an industry perspective?
Thank you. So I think we've talked a lot about, like John talking about machine generated data, like videos, like sensors. With web EOC, you have a lot more human generated data. So it's forms that are filled out by the public. It's resource requests coming from cities up to the state, from county to county. And what we've done is we've really had to to work on interoperability just with ourselves at first. Most states already are using WebEOC. Lots of the larger counties, we have a very, very large footprint across the US. But WebEOC's been out there since the 90s. So we had, installed at each location. We didn't have everyone in the cloud at first. So we had to start building technologies to connect just our own technology to each other. And that was like Tatum uses Fusion. They're very high Fusion users. Then we're adapting that to newer technologies with our Jabari Exchange. And then we start to see, well, what about how do we integrate or how do we make interoperability with other companies out there? And that's been a really a big challenge for the industry, I think. I know when you have standards like video or standards like cell phones and that technology, you really know who you're competing against or who you can interop with. When you're in a little bit more of a niche area, there aren't those technology standards already in place. In healthcare, as Phil mentioned, healthcare, I spent 20 years of my career in healthcare, and obviously HL7 and FHIR have come with standards so that you can talk to each other. We don't have that. So we've used our Jabari Exchange to start building a way to communicate with third parties. Unfortunately, it's not to a point where we're at a standard yet, and we have to work one-on-one with each vendor and say, how do we do that? And that's really where we're focused right now, is working with more and more vendors, both large and small. I think one thing that's great about our industry right now is there are just lots and lots of small companies that are entering in, and they have great tech. They just don't have a way to get it to our clients. So we're partnering with lots of smaller companies now, but we're having to create our own standard for that. And what we'd like to see is a place and time where we're not creating the standard. We are all working together to create that standard. So not as far ahead as, say, telecom and video and things like that, but that's definitely where we want to get.
Yeah, John.
I just want to make a comment about the standard. When we were doing a video interoperability solution for the state of Maryland and the National Capital Region, we said the same thing. We said, what's the video standard? Well, MPEG-4, and by the way, we've integrated with your solution. But we basically looked around and said, well, what does Netflix and YouTube use? And it's H.264. So we said, that's what we're picking. So sometimes you just got to pick one and go with it, and it becomes the de facto standard. And then other times it's the result of a standard setting body that we use, like what Dean is trying to do in the CAD world. So it's not either or, it's both.
Absolutely. Do you have any final comments, Carla, or any other? Okay, so I think we got 1 minute left or so, maybe time for one question. Sorry, can you go to the next slide, please, the last one? So just to say real quick, the RFI is out. It's going to close on May 24th. So if you know any companies that you think would be interested in getting involved in the ISF, bidding on this project, please forward me their names, and we want to make sure that they get eyes on that. But any questions from the audience? I think we only got time for one, maybe.
And interoperability between the videos and twins. Because what's going to happen, what would seem to be an straightforward comparison here, and a way to reduce the data complexity and volume that you're distributing would be some kind of direct video to a CAD twin of the urban environment that you're trying to get to. And that would seem to be an easy link. Is that something anybody's pursuing?
Yeah. Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So I deal a lot with performance testing on networks. And so in 4G, we go into a lab and we test the box. We'd overload it in parallel, like a telephony application server talking to an HSS or a packet gateway mobility management entity. But in 5G, because everything's getting virtualized, it's hard to say, okay,
You can do pod scaling, you can spin up Kubernetes to dilute like a DDoS attack. So we're looking at digital twin to figure out for the 5G core, when do we need to migrate like a priority network slice through different virtual functions in the control and user plane. And as long as we're working with the carriers and we can get a lot of their data, their morphology, their operational settings, we can do a lot of modeling with that. So we're going to do that first. And then once we get that performance and functional working for voice, data, video, and interoperability, then we're going to look at digital twin for like the information services part of data, video, and information services. And we'll be applying those ISF concepts to see when you have, because the way I see it is one, it's decorating the data or getting it into a format without a lot of what I think Jeff talked about with having like lots of different APIs. It gets very complicated. You can have APIs, gateways everywhere. When you have degradation in different parts of the network, you may not be able to put the data, especially like video, in the exact format you want. So you're going to have to make decisions on it. So we are looking at it, but we're starting first with performance of voice, data, and video.
Yeah, one last thing I want to say is the 3-layer cake, as I refer to it, the information sharing framework, it's not rocket science. Like, people get it. The fun part comes when you try to apply those concepts to an actual solution. We described it in 3 discrete layers, but it's not that simple in the real world. The question then becomes, all right, how much do I load in the presentation layer in the application on the phone? Or where do I perform the integration layer functions? Is it in a cloud with the AWS performing the credentialing functions, if you will? Where do I overlay security into this framework? So the framework is relatively straightforward, but it raises the questions you need to ask that then help you design the actual solution. And we don't dictate where. It could be done in the cloud, it could be done locally, it could be done in any different number of languages. That's the job of making the leap from the high-level architecture to a more detailed architecture. So we want people to use the ISF as the framework, hence the title framework, and for which they can orient around this issue of interoperability. So
I think we're probably at time. I just wanted to say, can we have a round of applause for our great panelists? Yeah, sorry, Chair. Did you have one final comment for us?
I just wanted to close with thanking the Information Sharing Framework Task Force for all the work they have done and done an incredible job bringing us this far. I also specifically want to thank Carla, John, and Rob for everything that you've done in leading this task force and putting things together. So with that, I hope everyone has a good lunch.
So we would have never had the task force if it hadn't been for Sheriff Fitz, and Todd Early was the one that was a big cheerleader this years ago. So we're going slow, but we're getting there. So thanks to Todd. We also had Chief Lewin from the Chicago PD that was a co-chair. So if it hadn't been for them, we wouldn't be doing any of this. So thanks.
So next on the agenda is identity credentialing and access management.